Imagine driving home late at night after a long shift, exhausted but relieved to finally be heading back. Suddenly, flashing red and blue lights fill your mirror. Confused, you pull over. You weren't speeding, your lights are fine, and you've done nothing wrong. But the officer's attitude is aggressive. He demands you step out, starts searching your car without permission, and treats you like a suspect. Fear creeps in. Then, another car pulls up. Your husband steps out, flashing a badge, and instantly, the officer's face drains of color. What was he trying to do? And why did he freeze? Stay with me because this story takes a turn you won't see coming. We've all heard of traffic stops that go wrong, but this one was different. Sarah, a hardworking nurse, was pulled over for no reason. The officer was aggressive, searching for something that wasn't there. But what he didn't know was that Sarah's husband wasn't just any man. He was an internal affairs detective. When he arrived, the officer's confidence crumbled. What was he hiding? And why did he panic the moment he saw Mark's badge? Stick around because this story is about to get intense. This isn't just a routine traffic stop. It's a shocking case of abuse of power, intimidation, and justice served in the most unexpected way. What if Sarah hadn't known her rights? What if her husband hadn't arrived in time? How many others have been victims of the same officer? As we unravel this story, you'll see how quickly power can shift when the truth is exposed. By the end, you'll be questioning just how often this happens, and who's really holding corrupt officers accountable. Stay tuned. Sarah had spent the last 12 hours on her feet, tending to patients, barely getting a moment to rest. It was just past midnight, and all she wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and collapse into bed. The streets were quiet, the air cool, and her mind was already shifting into relaxation mode. But that changed in an instant. The sudden flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror made her heart skip a beat. Confusion washed over her. She wasn't speeding, hadn't run a red light, and her car was in perfect condition. Still, she did what she was taught to do. She pulled over safely, kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, and waited for the officer to approach. Seconds later, heavy footsteps crunched against the pavement. The officer walked up to her window with a flashlight in one hand and the other resting on his holster. His expression wasn't neutral, it was intimidating. "License and registration," he barked. Sarah frowned but complied, reaching into her glove compartment and retrieving the documents. As she handed them over, she asked, "May I ask why I was pulled over, officer?" No answer. Instead, the officer stared at her ID for a moment before looking back at her. "Where are you coming from?" Sarah hesitated. That wasn't an answer to her question, but she stayed polite. "I just finished my shift at the hospital. I'm heading home." The officer's gaze didn't soften. "Have you been drinking tonight?" That question made her uneasy. "No, sir," she replied, keeping her voice calm. The officer let out a low hum, as if he didn't believe her. "Step out of the vehicle." Sarah's stomach tightened. "Excuse me?" "I said step out," he repeated, this time with a firmer tone. Something wasn't right. She knew traffic laws, and there was no legal reason for her to exit her vehicle unless the officer suspected a serious offense. She also knew she hadn't done anything wrong. "Officer, may I ask why?" she asked carefully. Instead of answering, he sighed dramatically, taking a step back and placing a hand on his belt. "Are you refusing to comply?" That was the moment Sarah felt fear creep in. She had seen videos of encounters like this, how quickly situations could spiral out of control. She took a deep breath and reached for her phone, sending a quick text to her husband. "Sarah, pulled over. Something feels off." As she placed her phone back on the passenger seat, she finally unbuckled her seatbelt and slowly opened the door. The officer stepped back, watching her like she was a threat. "Face the car. Hands on the hood," he ordered. Sarah's pulse pounded. "Am I being detained?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The officer smirked. "Just being cautious." That didn't sit right with her at all. As she pressed her palms against the cool surface of her car, she felt the weight of the officer's stare. He was circling her, looking at her like she had done something wrong, like he was waiting for an excuse to escalate the situation. "You sure you haven't been drinking?" he asked again. "I told you no," she replied, a bit firmer this time. The officer let out a low chuckle. You seem nervous. Of course, she was nervous. What kind of question was that? I'd like to know why I was pulled over, she repeated. The officer ignored her and instead walked toward the passenger side of her car, shining his flashlight inside. You got anything in here I should know about? No, she answered quickly. Mind if I take a look? Yes, actually, I do, she said. I don't consent to a search. The officer clicked his tongue and then spoke into his radio, though she couldn't make out what he was saying. A moment later, he turned back to her. Well, you see, he said, I smell something suspicious. Sarah's stomach dropped. She knew exactly what was happening. He was trying to create a reason to justify a search. There's nothing in my car, she insisted. The officer just smirked. And then, without another word, he opened her back door. That was the moment Sarah realized she was in serious trouble. Her mind raced. She knew her rights. He wasn't allowed to do this without probable cause or her permission, but he had just ignored that completely. Sarah's heart pounded. This wasn't right. She turned her head slightly. Sir, you do not have my consent to search my vehicle. The officer barely reacted. You don't look like you've got anything to hide, he muttered. But I'll be the judge of that. Sarah clenched her jaw. If he found something, anything, it wouldn't matter if it wasn't hers. He could twist the situation however he wanted. Her fingers twitched, itching to grab her phone. But before she could even think about what to do next, the faint sound of tires rolling up behind them caught her attention. The officer must have heard it too, because he suddenly stiffened. His hand, which had been casually resting on his belt, suddenly gripped it tighter. Sarah turned her head slightly and saw something that made relief wash over her. A black SUV had pulled up behind the officer's cruiser, and stepping out of it, wearing a serious expression and gripping his badge in his hand, was her husband. Sarah's breath hitched as she saw her husband, Mark, step out of the black SUV. He wasn't in uniform, but he didn't need to be. His presence alone shifted the entire energy of the situation. He held his badge up as he walked forward, his eyes locked onto the officer. The officer, who just seconds ago had been confident and smug, suddenly went rigid. His posture changed, his fingers twitching at his belt. Sarah saw the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He recognized Mark, and that's when she knew. This cop had messed up, but Mark didn't rush. He was calm, composed. His voice was firm when he spoke. What's going on here? The officer blinked, then straightened his stance, trying to regain control of the situation. Nothing, sir. Just a routine stop. Sarah's jaw clenched. Routine? Was that what he called illegal searches and intimidation? Mark's gaze shifted to Sarah, scanning her face, checking for signs of distress. Then, he looked at the open car door. His eyes narrowed. A routine stop? Mark repeated, his tone sharp. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're conducting an illegal search without probable cause or consent. The officer swallowed hard. Sir, she was acting suspiciously. Mark tilted his head. Suspicious how? The officer faltered for a moment, then cleared his throat. She refused to step out of the vehicle at first. Sarah's blood boiled. Because you never gave me a reason why I had to. Mark held up a hand, signaling for Sarah to stay calm. Then he turned back to the officer. That's not a reason to search her car. The officer shifted uncomfortably. I thought I smelled something. Mark's eyes narrowed. You thought you smelled something? And that justified opening her car without her permission? The officer didn't answer right away. His silence spoke volumes. He had no legitimate reason. Sarah could see it clearly now. This officer was used to pushing people around, banking on the fact that most wouldn't know their rights or would be too scared to challenge him. But this time, he had picked the wrong person to intimidate. Mark took a step closer, his presence towering. Run her plates? The officer hesitated. No, sir. Mark let out a slow breath, his patience wearing thin. So let me get this straight. You pulled her over without cause. You made her exit the vehicle without explanation, and then you searched her car without running her plates first? The officer's jaw clenched. He knew he was trapped. He had overstepped his bounds, and now, standing in front of an internal affairs detective, he couldn't wiggle his way out of it. Sarah watched as Mark's expression darkened. He wasn't just upset. He was furious. But he kept his composure. "What's your name, officer?" Mark asked, his voice dangerously calm. The officer's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. Officer Reed, sir." Mark pulled out his phone and started typing. "Badge number?" Officer Reed hesitated for a moment before muttering a series of numbers. Mark nodded. "Good. Now, I want to know exactly why you pulled my wife over tonight." Reed opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His brain was scrambling for an excuse, but there wasn't one that would hold up. Mark's patience snapped. "Let me make this easy for you. If you don't have a valid reason for stopping her, I'm going to assume this was an abuse of power. And if that's the case, you and I are going to have a much bigger problem." Officer Reed's face turned pale. His earlier confidence had completely vanished. Sarah felt a surge of relief, but also anger. How many people had this officer done this to? How many times had he gotten away with it simply because the person he pulled over didn't have someone to stand up for them? Mark took a slow step forward. "Now, I'm going to ask you again. What was the reason?" Reed's mouth opened and closed, his face twisting as he struggled for an answer. Finally, he muttered, She looked nervous." Mark blinked. "She looked nervous?" His tone was dripping with disbelief. Reed quickly backtracked. "I mean," she hesitated to get out of the car. Mark's expression was unreadable, but Sarah knew what was coming next. "You know what makes people nervous, Officer Reed?" Mark asked, stepping even closer. "Getting pulled over for no reason. Getting treated like a suspect when they've done nothing wrong. Being ordered out of their car without being told why." Reed looked like he wanted to disappear. He didn't dare argue. Mark inhaled deeply, shaking his head. "You abused your authority tonight. You ignored protocol, violated her rights, and now you're trying to cover it up. But let me tell you something. You just made the biggest mistake of your career." Reed's breath hitched. "Sir, I didn't mean." Mark cut him off. "Save it." He pulled out his phone again and tapped on the screen. "Because I'm reporting you right now." Reed's eyes widened. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. He had lost all control of the situation. Sarah watched as Mark turned away from the officer and placed his phone to his ear. His voice was sharp when he spoke. "Yeah, this is Detective Mark Reynolds. I need a supervisor at my location immediately. I've got an officer conducting unlawful searches during a traffic stop. Badge number." He glanced at Reed. "Reed, you better pray they don't already have complaints against you." Reed swallowed hard but said nothing. He had no defense. Sarah let out a slow breath, finally feeling the tension in her body start to ease. She wasn't alone. And more importantly, justice was about to be served. As Mark hung up the call, he turned back to Reed, his expression stone cold. "You're done here." Reed didn't argue. He simply stood there, frozen, waiting for the inevitable consequences to unfold. And Sarah? She finally felt safe again. A heavy silence filled the air. The once smug Officer Reed now stood stiff, his face pale, his hands nervously twitching at his sides. The power dynamic had completely flipped. Moments ago, he had been the one in control, barking orders and searching Sarah's car without cause. Now, he was just another officer caught red-handed. And he knew it. Sarah exhaled slowly, her hands still slightly trembling from the adrenaline coursing through her system. She glanced at her husband. Mark was composed, but she could tell by the tightness of his jaw that he was furious. They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, the faint sound of another set of sirens pierced the air. A second patrol car pulled up behind them, and from it stepped a man in a crisp uniform, Lieutenant Harris. Mark immediately turned to him. "Lieutenant," he greeted, his voice clipped and professional. Lieutenant Harris looked between Mark, Sarah, and Officer Reed, his brow furrowed. "Detective Reynolds? What's going on here?" Mark wasted no time. "This officer pulled my wife over without cause. He conducted an unlawful search of her vehicle, and when questioned, he failed to provide a legitimate reason for the stop." Harris's expression darkened. His gaze shifted to Reed, who now looked like a deer caught in headlights. "Is that true, Officer Reed?" Harris asked, his voice measured but firm. Reed hesitated. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. Sir, I believed I smelled something suspicious. Harris raised a hand, cutting him off. You believed? That's not how probable cause works. Sarah folded her arms, feeling a surge of satisfaction as Reed squirmed under his superior's glare. Mark wasn't done. He also never ran her plates before initiating the search, never informed her why she was stopped, and when she rightfully questioned his actions, he accused her of acting nervous, as if that justified a violation of her rights. Harris let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. Reed, tell me you didn't do this. Reed opened his mouth, then shut it. He had no defense. Harris's jaw tightened. He turned back to Sarah. Ma'am, I sincerely apologize for this. Sarah gave a small nod, though the frustration still simmered beneath her skin. I just want to know why I was targeted, because it certainly wasn't for a legitimate reason. Harris nodded solemnly, then looked back at Reed. You know the protocol, Reed. Dashcam and bodycam footage. Now. Reed hesitated again. That single moment of hesitation sent alarm bells ringing in Sarah's head. Mark noticed too. What's the problem, officer? He asked, his tone sharp. Reed licked his lips. I didn't activate my bodycam right away. Mark's eyes flashed. Convenient. Harris let out a heavy sigh, his patience clearly thinning. Dashcam? Reed's fingers twitched. I don't know if it was recording. That was it. That was the moment Sarah knew this wasn't just an abuse of power. It was a pattern. He had done this before. Harris's expression turned stony. Detective Reynolds, he said, turning to Mark. Would you like to officially file a complaint? Mark didn't hesitate. Absolutely. Sarah had never felt more relieved. Reed's breathing grew shallow. Sir, Harris held up a hand. Save it. Hand over your badge and weapon. Reed's eyes widened. Sir? You heard me, Harris snapped. Until this is investigated, you're relieved of duty. Sarah didn't expect things to move that quickly, but clearly, Reed had enough of a history that Harris wasn't willing to cover for him. With reluctant movements, Reed unhooked his belt and placed his firearm and badge in Harris's outstretched hand. Harris shook his head in disappointment. I'll be pulling your traffic stop history. If I find a pattern, I promise you, this will go beyond just suspension. Reed's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. He had no choice. He was caught. Mark turned to Sarah, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Are you okay? She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I am now. Harris exhaled and turned back to Sarah. Again, I'm sorry this happened. If there's anything else you need. There is, Mark interjected. She needs a copy of this report, in full. Harris nodded without hesitation. Of course. And just like that, it was over. Sarah had gone from feeling helpless to watching justice unfold right in front of her. She had seen an officer abuse his authority, only to be held accountable by the very system he thought would protect him. But the question that still lingered in her mind was this. How many others had suffered before him? The weight of the night still clung to Sarah as she sat in the passenger seat of Mark's SUV, watching the flashing lights of the patrol cars fade into the distance. The ordeal was over, for her at least, but the uneasy feeling in her gut told her this wasn't just about one bad cop. Mark remained silent for a while, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. She knew him well enough to recognize that his mind was still processing everything. Finally, she spoke. How many others do you think he's done this to? Mark let out a slow breath. More than I'd like to admit. That was the part that made her the angriest. If Mark hadn't arrived, if she hadn't known her rights, if she had been just a little more afraid to speak up, who knows how that night would have ended? And how many others had found themselves in that same situation, with no one to back them up? Sarah shook her head. What happens to him now? Mark's jaw clenched. Internal Affairs will open an investigation. If he has a history of misconduct, which I'd bet money he does, he won't just be suspended. He could lose his badge for good. She wanted to feel satisfied with that answer, but something still nagged at her. And if there's no record? Mark glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Then we make sure there is one now. Sarah knew Mark wasn't the kind of man to let things slide. And she also knew that bad cops like Reed relied on one thing to keep getting away with their abuse: silence. And she refused to be silent. Mark must have sensed the thoughts running through her mind because he reached over, squeezing her hand gently. "You did everything right, Sarah." She let out a shaky breath. "Did I?" Mark nodded firmly. "You knew your rights. You didn't let him intimidate you. You stayed calm." He paused before adding, "But most importantly, you spoke up." And that, she realized, was what truly mattered. Because that was how people like Reed lost their power. Not by letting fear win. Not by staying quiet and hoping things got better. But by standing up, asking questions, and refusing to let injustice go unchecked. Sarah knew this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been pulled over and felt powerless. Every person who had been harassed, threatened, or taken advantage of by someone who thought their badge made them untouchable. As they pulled into their driveway, she turned to Mark. "I want to follow up on his case." Mark smiled slightly. "I had a feeling you'd say that." She smirked. "You know me too well." He nodded. "And that's why I love you." Sarah exhaled, feeling the last bit of tension leave her body. She was home. She was safe. And most importantly, she had made sure that Officer Reed would never pull this stunt on anyone else again. But the fight against corruption wasn't over. It was just beginning. Sarah's story wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a system where power, when unchecked, could be abused. That night, she stood her ground, and with Mark by her side, justice was served. But what about those who don't have someone like Mark to step in? What about those who don't know their rights? This isn't just one story, it's a reality for many. And the only way to change that is by speaking up, demanding accountability, and never staying silent when injustice happens. What would you do in Sarah's situation? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, stick with us, because we have more stories to tell. If you love gripping stories that expose truth and demand justice, hit that subscribe button now. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that matters. Your voice, your awareness, it all makes a difference. Let's build a community that stands for what's right. See you in the next one.